I've just watched the episode of The Crown entitled Aberfan. This is episode three on the third series, with Olivia Colman in the role of the Queen. It was a profoundly moving episode. Um, Most people in Britain will know what Aberfan is about, but for any international viewers, basically this was a big tragedy that occurred in 1966, October 1966, when a small Welsh mining community was utterly devastated by a disaster in which a coal heap, so this is the refuge material from coal mining, um, it was basically like a landslide. It fell down onto the town. I think it was a village then, actually, and it was particularly devastating because primary school was right in its path, and most of the 144 people who died, I think 118 were children. So you can imagine the impact of this. An awful tragedy. Um, Sometimes we look at the grainy footage in black and white. It seems like a long time ago, yet by the same token, it's only 55 years ago. It's not really far back. It's still well within living memory. So, yeah, it's one of the worst disasters to have hit this country in the 20th century. But anyway, the particular episode, and this is a spoiler if you haven't seen The Crown, so stop listening now. It particularly focuses on the response of the Queen and Harold Wilson. Harold Wilson, of course, was the Labour Prime Minister at the time, and he was pretty quick to act. At least this is how the episode portrayed it. He went straight to the site, and there was very real anger there at the National Coal Board and over whose responsibility it was. Families had warned about the dangers. Apparently, the slack heap was 5 times higher than the legal limit that it was supposed to be at. But there was a perception that, or at least the episode really focuses on Queen's role in this and how she was basically perceived to be out of touch and a bit cold in her response. When first told of the news, for example, she says, royalty visits hospitals, that's what we do, or something along those lines. And it makes her look, frankly, quite cold and uncaring. Now, the line that she used was, having a member of the royal family there, especially the monarch, would just get in the way of the emergency services. And the whole dynamic of this got me thinking about when it is right for leaders to visit disaster sites and not. But before I get into that, a little bit more background on Aberfan. The Queen did visit. I've watched a British Cafe footage of this, and it's some controversy over that episode, although it was very powerful. There's some controversy over to what extent was it a fair portrayal of how things transpired. However, they do their homework and they did say in the little footnotes at the end that to this day, it's the thing that, according to her personal friends, the Queen most regrets about her reign was her prolonged, slow response to Aberfan, how she didn't initially visit the site. Um, Also, it shows some tensions between Wilson and the Queen, the perception that Marcia Williams and other Labour figures, this was Wilson's close confidant, let's just put it that way, at the time, she felt that, and other Labour figures felt that it could sort of pass the blame to the establishment. Again, how much of that is true, I don't know. But certainly, you get the impression that there was some controversy and some anger over the Queen's slow response. This happened as well at Lockerbie, apparently, albeit to a lesser extent. She did visit Lockerbie. Um, Here's the thing, there's been many disasters and many tragedies during the Queen's reign. There's been train crashes, plane crashes, terrorist attacks, fires. There's been many events. I mean, just look at the late 80s alone, the number of disasters that happened then. And the Queen certainly hasn't had the same sort of response to all of them. But Aberfan, I think, was different because so many of the victims were children. Um, in recent years, of course, the Manchester bombing, she visited the victims in hospital. And, very much in her style, it was very, she expressed sympathy. But it has to be said, the Queen does have a certain distance. She expressed sympathy and, said how it was a wicked thing. But I do think she has a different approach from Charles, for example, and definitely from William and Harry. Um, that's why I think when her reign comes to an end, I do think there will be a kind of different approach in how the monarch, Charles, uh, as the situation will then be. I do think there will be a difference, but there's different ways to look at this. In this case, we're talking about the sovereign and the sovereign's response to disaster. Now, more common is criticism of politicians' response. And I can cite many examples of this. Theresa May was really made a scapegoat for the Grenfell tragedy 4 years ago. There was those very ugly scenes of the Prime Minister being heckled and jeered, um, and so was Sadiq Khan, so were other leading politicians. But May really got heat for that. To the point I think there were security issues actually. It was quite ugly. But here's the thing. Grenfell Tower was built in the 70s under a Labour government. Um, so that's a good example of a disaster being used as a political football. It was a horrendous disaster. I mean, 72 people lost their lives, others injured, others made homeless. And it was only 4 years ago. I remember the impact of that. Uh, I know that when members of the royal family visited, they got a warmer reception. I do think in Britain, generally speaking, royals get a warmer reception than politicians, just as a general rule. I think it's very rare that a politician, any politician, right up to the Prime Minister, will be more popular than the Queen. I don't think it's ever happened, in fact, with the possible exception of, well, I was going to say of Churchill, but bear in mind the Queen, when the Queen ascended the throne, that was Churchill's second term, and is generally regarded as more lackluster than his first term. Um, Tony Blair probably was briefly more popular than the Queen for that brief period in 1997 with the whole Diana thing. Then, of course, Blair's popularity rapidly declined after Iraq. Um, I think when you're constantly in public life and you're in a demanding, pressurizing role, something like popularity and democracy is very, very fragile. Um, it can change with circumstance. May had her 6 month sort of honeymoon period, and then after Grenville and Manchester, things just really got rough. But here's the question. When is it appropriate for a leader to visit or not visit? Because I do think, and I appreciate I might be in a minority with this, but I think it has to be said. There is definitely a sense of damned if they do and damned if they don't. So, as an example of this, when there were floods in the south of England in, I think it was 2011 or 2012, I mean, south of England often gets floods, but on one of those occasions, David Cameron went to visit and he got heckled and he got heavily criticised. My follow up there would be, well, would he not be criticised if he didn't visit? I think it's a little unfair to condemn politicians for visiting and saying, oh, they're only there for a photo op, but by the same token say, if they don't turn up, then, oh, they obviously don't care. I'm not talking so much about the relatives, people directly involved in tragedy, because that's raw emotion, and that's, you can't necessarily think objectively when you're going through that sort of pain. But I think for example, newspapers, their criticism I think is a bit unfair sometimes because, there's different ways to look at it. On one hand, let's say there's a major terrorist attack. The Prime Minister would make a statement, they would chair a Cobra meeting. Um, would it be appropriate for them to visit the victims? Well, I would say at some point they definitely should if it's a large scale attack, like on the scale of Manchester or the London bombings. Or another type of disaster like Grenfell. I do think it's appropriate and it should be as soon as possible. However, I don't think it should be immediately as the event unfolds because then obviously they would be in the way of emergency services because they'd have their own security detail and that would just complicate matters. And then, people would have to set up a podium for the speech and so on, and it kind of detracts from that. So I think a good balance, a good approach is maybe to do it the day after, not absolutely immediately, but the day after, not a week after, the day after. To me, that's probably the right time frame. But I just think that there needs to be a sort of understanding that in situations of tragedy and disaster, emotions are raw, and people naturally want someone to blame. Um, I do think politicians need to be careful not to be seen as out of touch, even more so than the royal family, because as politicians, they're legislators. They're the people who make the laws that change lives. So, they're in the constant focus of the press. So is the royal family, but in a different way. So, something like a flooded community, say that the prime minister or the leader of the opposition is just turning up to get photo ops. I think that's a bit unfair. Is it not the case that they're turning up because it's the right thing to do and because they would be criticised for not turning up? I suppose the counter argument is that they only turn up when there is a disaster. And what about the investment that sometimes leads to a lack of resources that might cause a disaster in the first place? Then that can come down to local government. It's not necessarily the fault of central government. Um, I really think when it comes to tragedy and disaster, it's in human nature to want to blame someone. Now, in the case of Aberfan, there were very serious mistakes that were made, and I believe it was criminal negligence. For example, for the slack heap to be much higher than it should have been, things like that. And it's lessons must be learned. Sounds very cold almost when the fact has happened. Um, but it's just something to think about. Politicians need to tread a careful line, so do members of the royal family. For me, if I was prime minister, let me just put my cards on the line. If I was prime minister and there was a Grenfell type disaster, I wouldn't go immediately there because I wouldn't want to get in the way of the emergency services. I would turn up the following day, and if it meant a bit of heckling and a bit of jeering, then that's something I'd have to just face. May did visit, and there were some quite ugly scenes. In my view, that was unfortunate because she was being scapegoated for something that wasn't necessarily her fault. She'd been prime minister for at that point. I think it was about a year at that point. Well, 11 months, and she was kind of being blamed for something that would have been, in the 70s when Grenfell was built. Theresa May was a teenager, so sometimes politicians can be criticised unfairly, but I think there's a degree of kind of taking it on the chin, understanding raw emotions, and sometimes it's not fair, but you have to take it on the chin. That's why it's a very difficult, demanding job because you are relentlessly criticised by the press, by the public, and sometimes they get it wrong. Sometimes criticism is valid. For example, if a disaster happens because central government has made cuts, then there's legitimate criticism. But anyway, those are just some things to think about. And I thought that episode very profoundly moving, very strong performances. And looking at the archival footage, it seemed that they got the details very, very correct in terms of the Queen's mannerisms. She went there, she didn't. It's just not in her style to be overly dramatic and really show her emotions. But you could tell that she was somber. I think she was probably genuinely moved by it. I think the Queen, and actually Theresa May had this problem as well, although May was obviously a lot younger. But I think we sometimes have this idea that just because someone isn't crying and openly showing emotions, then they're somehow stone, that they don't have emotions. People show emotions in different ways. This was one of the main criticisms of May, like the Maybot attack line. I think it was a little unfair. I mean, I never met May, but I'm just going to say I quite liked her. She wasn't a great prime minister, and she won't go down as a great prime minister. But I think some of the attacks were a bit unfair. I did get correspondence from her actually, about 15 years ago when she was pretty junior, shadow work and pensions, I think. And it was something about the Tories' attitude to the unemployed. And she kind of blamed the media for that and said it was distorted. But yeah, I have correspondence from Theresa May. Anyway, let me know your thoughts.